and turn it over to Kevin.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm glad that you could join us this afternoon as we talk about the whistleblower policy. Perhaps not the most exciting topic necessarily, but certainly something that is very key when it comes to looking at the overall internal control structure of an organization. The agenda for this afternoon is first to dive a little bit deeper into what is a whistleblower. Second, why should we have such a policy? What's the purpose and benefit of such a policy? And then finally, hopefully I will be able to convince you that having a whistleblower policy is a good idea. And so then we will spend some time on developing a policy and what are some of the key crucial elements as we look at that policy development. So with those learning objectives in mind, let's go ahead and look at the first one. What is a whistleblower? And of course, nowadays, the first place that everyone turns to definitions is Wikipedia, and I'm no exception to that. So whistleblower is a person who exposes any kind of information or activity that is deemed illegal, dishonest, or not correct within an organization that is either private or public. The information of alleged wrongdoing can be classified in many ways: violation of company policy or rules, law, regulation, or threat to the public interest and or national security, as well as fraud and corruption. On this slide, I had a picture of the cover of Time magazine from 2002 when the whistleblowers were the Person of the Year, but I did not have the copyright permission for that, and I didn't want anyone to become a whistleblower on me and turn me in for not having the copyright, so I took the picture out. So Time magazine, as well as other people, have indicated the importance of whistleblowers over time, and like I said, in 2002, whistleblowers as a general group of people were considered the Persons of the Year. Some famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, whistleblowers over time: Bradley Manning, who was the Army soldier who leaked information to WikiLeaks; Sharon Watkins, who was at the center of the Enron Corporation whistleblowing that led to the downfall of that organization and the exposure of the activities that were going on there. Similar to Sharon was Cynthia Cooper at WorldCom, MCI, if you remember that entity, which doesn't exist anymore. Colleen Rowley from the FBI reported on some tactics that were used there as well. We had 60 Minutes tobacco executive on 60 Minutes that leaked the story on nicotine within the tobacco industry, Jeffrey Wigand. Mark Whitaker was the famous whistleblower related to price fixing at ADM, or Archer Daniels Midland. Karen Silkwood talked about nuclear safety at Kerr McGee. You might remember there was a movie made about that. And who could forget Deep Throat, the Watergate whistleblower, and that name finally came out subsequent to his death, Mark Felt. So what happens to whistleblowers? Well, typically what happens to whistleblowers, the vast majority of whistleblowers, they end up with job loss. And that's really kind of the purpose for the whole whistleblowing policy, is to protect against that. So 62% of people who have blown the whistle in organizations that didn't have whistleblower policies lost their job. That's pretty significant, but another 18% were either harassed or transferred to a different position, and an additional 11% had their salary reduced. Currently, with organizations that do not have whistleblowers, the only thing that there were only 9% of whistleblowers who had nothing negative that happened to them. So clearly, the vast majority of people, when whistleblower protection is not in place, have some negative ramification. Of course, other employees see that and quickly lose any type of motivation to report any type of wrongdoing if they can see that they'll properly or promptly be rewarded by losing their job, getting transferred to a less desirable position, or having their salary reduced. So thus the purpose for having a whistleblower. We look at our second learning objective, why have a whistleblower? Well, it's really kind of as simple as it's the law. Federal law prohibits all corporations, including nonprofits, from retaliating against employees who blow the whistle on their employers' financial management and accounting practices. In addition to federal law, there's also 45 states have enacted additional laws to protect whistleblowers from retaliation in the workplace. So really, we probably don't need to go any deeper than just figuring out it's the law, and of course we all want to be in compliance with the law, so it's what we would do. However, looking at it specifically, why is it the law? Well, Sarbanes-Oxley, the largest expanse of internal control regulation to hit corporate management and forever, said specifically there are two provisions that apply to all corporations. Keep in mind that Sarbanes-Oxley, for the most part, refers to for-profit entities, specifically those that are traded on some sort of exchange. However, there are two provisions in Sarbanes-Oxley that applies to all corporations, whether they are for-profit or not for-profit. The first of those provisions is document retention, and the second is the whistleblower protection. We're only here today to talk about the whistleblower protection, not to talk about the document retention. BoardSource takes the implications of Sarbanes-Oxley related to the nonprofit organizations when they state, while nearly all the provisions of the bill apply only to publicly traded corporations, the passage of this bill should serve as a wake-up call to the entire nonprofit community. If nonprofit leaders do not ensure effective governance of their organizations, the government may step forward and also regulate nonprofit governance. Indeed, some state attorney generals are already proposing that elements of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act may be applied to nonprofit organizations. And of course, specifically to the two provisions we just previously mentioned, those do apply to nonprofit organizations as well. Another reason to incorporate or to include a whistleblower protection policy for your organization is the Form 990. In Part 4 of the 990, we have the regulation on governance, management, and disclosure. And you'll remember that the Form 990 is the annual tax form that has to be completed by nonprofit organizations. Of course, because we are a nonprofit, we don't typically have tax that we are paying under most circumstances. But this document, this Form 990, is a way to communicate government, management, and other information to the general public about our organization. In Section B, we specifically have to answer a series of questions related to policies and procedures that either are in place or not in place. Question number 13 in that section says, did the organization have a written whistleblower policy? Now, of course, you're given two answers here. You can either check the yes box or the no box. I will tell you that there is a right answer and a wrong answer. The right answer to the question is yes. You want to be able to check yes for all of these questions. If you indicate no on the 990, these are considered red flags, and you should expect to have a call from the IRS to have a further conversation with you. However, I am not suggesting that you indicate yes if your organization does not, in fact, have a whistleblower policy. That is even worse yet, to not indicate a truthful answer to the IRS. The instructions to the 990 give further clarification of what is meant. A whistleblower policy encourages staff and volunteers to come forward with credible information on illegal practices or violations of adopted policies of the organization, specifies that the organization will protect the individual from retaliation, and identifies those staff or board members or outside parties to whom such information should be reported. So if that's not enough justification, federal law, state law, Sarbanes-Oxley, the Form 990, The other requirement that is rather new is the CSBG organizational standards. Specifically here, Standard 7.7 says the organization has a whistleblower policy that has been approved by the governing board. Clearly, there's a large justification on authoritative regulatory requirements that mandate having a whistleblower policy. In addition to that, there are other benefits of having a policy, even if it wasn't required. The existence of a whistleblower policy increases the transparency of operation of your nonprofit organization. It is clearly a standard of sound governance within a nonprofit organization. These things will just simply help make your organization better. It is prudent risk management. It is another way to gather information on the shortcomings of the organization and things that can be enhanced. It positions an organization to correct a problem. We can't fix what we don't know is wrong. Whistleblowers, although it may seem extreme, is a way to gather additional information on the organization and find where we might have a potential shortcoming. It helps build employee morale. Organizations, it has been proven, that have stronger governance and control make employees more content and more happy to be employed there. And finally, it assists in protecting employer from claims of retribution. So as the employer in an organization, if you have taken the proactive step and have adopted a whistleblower policy, it clearly positions you to have a much stronger argument when it comes to any type of question of violation of this standard. So developing something is better than having nothing at all. And given those first two learning objectives, I would like to pause here briefly to ask if there are any questions at this point.
Kevin, we haven't received any. Just wanted to remind everybody you can send your questions through the Q&A window or send me any messages through the chat window as well, and we can send those over and read them aloud to Kevin. But it doesn't look like we have any.
Okay, sounds good. Well, then let's go on. Apparently, I've convinced everyone that it is a good idea to have a whistleblower policy. So let's talk then about developing that policy. Some of the considerations that we would want to make are, first of all, what are really the goals of a good, well-developed written whistleblower policy? So first of all, your policy should encourage employees and volunteers to come forward. This is to remove the negative stigma around tattling or telling the truth to someone and removing those negative implications that could happen. Second is to protect the whistleblower from retaliation. And finally, third is to establish a reporting and investigation procedure. In other words, we need to have some sort of process and procedure laid out, and you would want to do that as part of your whistleblower policy. So how would we do that? Well, first of all, we want to think about what types of claims, what is the scope of this type of policy. Generally, the three major scopes of a whistleblower policy would be to provide coverage related to fraudulent accounting practices, which we could see from a number of our examples of famous or infamous whistleblowers, was where those resided. Unsafe working conditions, so things that put people's lives or safety and health at risk, and areas of alleged discrimination. We want to think about where we should place the policy. We know that we need to have a written policy, and then we need to think about where is the best place to put that policy. I can think of four major potential locations. One would be in the employee manual, potentially the bylaws, the board policies and procedure handbook, and as a standalone item. I'm recommending that you would incorporate it into either the board policies procedures handbook so that the board is aware of this, as well as the employee manual so that the employee is made aware of this policy as well. The next consideration you need to consider is who should the policy cover? What groups of people? Well, pretty clearly, this policy needs to cover employees. It really doesn't need to go any further than that necessarily. However, as a best practice, I think including your directors so that they may make comments to put into process some investigation, members, if you have an organization that has members, and also volunteers. Basically, volunteers are unpaid employees of the organization. Volunteers are involved in the organization throughout and have good eyes and ears, and I think that you would want to take advantage of the information and knowledge that they have of your organization. The policy should be drafted and implemented by management is the appropriate place to have it developed. And as a final step in this process, to give very clear understanding of the importance that the entire organization places on this policy, is it should be reviewed, approved, and supported by the board of directors. Those in charge of governance should have a stamp of approval on this policy to ensure that it is approved and encouraged at the highest levels within the organization. Then, who should receive the complaints? One of the major outputs of a written whistleblower policy is that there are complaints or statements that are made, and someone would need to investigate those complaints. There are a number of different individuals within an organization that can receive those. Depending on the size of your organization, it's possible that your organization has a compliance officer. The compliance officer would be a logical place for these types of allegations to be advanced, but a lot of our organizations aren't big enough to have a compliance officer. If that's the case, we may substitute that person with the executive director or the chief executive officer, someone at a very high level within the organization. It may also be the chief financial officer. It potentially might be a board member. Maybe it's the president of the board, or potentially the treasurer or the secretary of the board. That is another possibility. Many organizations have this complaint get forwarded to the director of human resources or the human resources officer within the organization. Organizations that may anticipate issues of discrimination typically have the complaints come to a human resource officer. Once again, some organizations have audit committees and some organizations do not. For those organizations that do have audit committees, that might be another location for the alleged complaints to go to get investigated or shepherded through the process. A final option is to outsource the function. Sometimes it is beneficial to have someone outside the organization receive the issue so that it doesn't come within the organization. This gives additional comfort potentially to those people that are potentially providing instances of alleged violations of policies or procedures, that comfort level that it's outside and that someone is not going to be receiving it internally, and that they don't need to provide their name to that organization, and really keeps it anonymous. Then you need to decide what types of activities are covered. Is it illegal activities, things that would be violation of the law, financial fraud or accounting type fraud, reporting issues, or conflict of interest? And certainly a conflict of interest policy, or a written whistleblower policy rather, can encompass all of these things. It doesn't have to include just one or the other. Of course, it's possible too that based on the different types of claims that might be alleged, that could determine who receives the complaint either within or outside the organization. Okay, so those are some overall arching thoughts and concepts of developing a whistleblower policy. Now let's look at the 5 W's of developing the policy. First of all, who? Who's responsible for reporting? Clearly, in my mind, this should be scoped very early in the statement as you're writing it, and it should be an issue of putting everyone on responsibility for reporting things. It's not just a means to protect individuals who do report, but it is also to transfer that responsibility and make sure everyone understands that whether they are an employee, a director, or a volunteer within the organization, it is an expectation of their duties that they would report a violation of any of the laws, rules, or policies of that organization. Also, doing this helps that tone at the top. When we talk about COSO's internal control structure, one of the things we talk about is what is the tone at the top. This is another great way, besides potentially a fraud or conflict of interest policy, is to talk about that tone and to create very clear expectations for ethical operations of your business. It positions the organization as an ethical entity, makes it very clear what is included and what's expected of everyone in their role in the organization. Further, it removes any question on what the organization expects. This gets rid of any ambiguity around employees who may say, oh, well, I didn't know if I was supposed to do that or not. It removes that possibility and provides very clear communication to all involved. Of course, it needs to be communicated to be effective, and how your organization may choose to do that is certainly up to you, and I don't think you have to just pick one option to do it. I think the more the merrier in terms of doing that. Providing the information in the employee manual is one way, but that's very passive. I think it's important to actively make point of the comment as opposed to just assume that the employee is going to read it in the employee manual. We would suggest encouraging it to be included in ongoing training, and at a bare minimum, if you have a new employee orientation process, this should be part of that conversation early on to let people know what is expected of them as employees and to indicate a very clear chain of who they should be providing information to so that they understand that their role will be protected. The second W is the what. The key what here, without any doubt, is that no retaliation will be taken for any good faith effort of reporting any violation. This is the crux, it's at the heart of a whistleblower policy and is sort of the piece that's not negotiable in terms of what the content must be. You certainly can employ best practices and move beyond that standard, but at a minimum, your policy would have to state there is no retribution or retaliation for providing information. For employees, more specifically, this would mean no adverse employment consequences. Those adverse employment consequences should probably be spelled out, talking about firing or termination, demotion, lack of compensation, or loss of position within the organization, to make it very clear what the employee can expect for coverage and safeguards. And finally, probably some definition of what is good faith reporting. Although one of the frequent concerns that we hear about whistleblower policies is, aren't we going to have a rash of people reporting things that are really not applicable? And that is why we want to have very clear definitions up front on what is included in the whistleblower protection policy and what is not included. And we are protecting the employee when they have a good faith reporting, not when they're retaliating on someone or when they don't like what someone else is doing and whether that is included or not. Of course, then very clear communication is the key to make sure that the person understands that what they did report does not fall under that definition and is not protected information. Third is the when. What is the expected time frame from when an incident was noted? Is the expectation immediate? Is it within 30 days? Is it within 2 weeks? What you don't want is to leave too big of an open gap so that someone can say, oh yeah, I was going to report that. Even though it happened 9 months ago, I was going to report it on the 1-year anniversary if nothing happened. You want to set out an expectation. Clearly here, the expectation is something that is timely. Immediate is probably not a good goal because immediate gives no room for flexibility, but something that says, within 30 days of the incident. Where is the next W in our 5 Ws? Where do the complaints go? We talked about this already. Audit Committee, Board of Directors, Human Resource Director, Executive Director, etc. Define where that complaint should go. We talked about also that one of the places that it might go is to an outsourced function. If you Google whistleblower outsource, you will find a number of organizations that provide that service for organizations, and you can pay a fee to be part of that network. I don't believe that that fee is very expensive, although I have not really dug into it too awful much, but it might be something, if you're interested, to look at it as one possibility. Next, consider what happens when the accused is the report to person. So if the person that is supposed to be reported to is the CFO, and it's the CFO who's cooked the books, that would be rather clumsy. You need to make sure that there is a safety valve, and maybe that safety valve even has 2 or 3 levels where if that person is involved, the complaint can go to someone else. Typically what I've seen is that the first level is someone inside the organization, whether that's the HR director, the CEO of the organization, or the executive director, or the CFO. And then if someone at that level is involved, that the complaint then go to the board chair. Really, once you get to the board chair of an organization, there isn't anything higher within that organization, and then it would be outside the organization, which really is not part of the whistleblower policy. But certainly if there's an illegal act and nothing is done internally, you may want to even include that in your policy to recommend that the person seek outside assistance if, as a last resort, nothing is done or addressed. And finally, consider the confidentiality of the reporter. Some organizations have anonymous reporting, and others require that there be a person indicated. If the person's position is protected and the organization wants to conduct a thorough investigation of the situation, it is very hard to conduct an investigation if you don't know who to talk to about the allegation. So as good as having an anonymous process might sound, it might not actually be very functional to assist with the investigation process that should be included as part of your whistleblower policy. So you may want to think very clearly about what that process is for reporting and whether the confidentiality of the reporter is going to be allowed or not. And maybe it's not allowed or not, but maybe it's encouraged or unencouraged. And then finally, the 5th W, which is actually an H, of course, is how. We talked about whether that is anonymous or not, is one piece of the how. The other is, must it be in writing? If it is not required to be in writing, there is some ambiguity that can result about whether something was actually made as a whistleblower issue or not, requesting investigation. It provides a clear written paper trail to whether something was reported or not. It starts the documentation process, it provides additional information and evidence, And if you don't require it in writing, there's really no good way to follow up and ensure that all instances were investigated. Third point here is investigation. What level of detail do you want included in your policy about investigation? So how are the results going to be communicated? First of all, is the investigation process itself, is who is going to do the investigation? What form might that take? Now, some policies, some written policies, have a lot of clarity and a lot of information on what the investigation process will look like. Other policies are very vague on that and say an appropriate investigation will be conducted. What you do want to include is how do you close the loop on that process? Once the investigation is complete, how do you report back to the whistleblower that the investigation is complete? What can the whistleblower expect back for information? Will they just know that the investigation is complete, or will they actually know the outcome of that investigation, whether it is a positive or a negative finding, and what can we expect from that process? And then finally, will there be an appeals process? Not all, and most, I would say, whistleblower policies don't actually have an appeals process per se, but that is an option, and your organization should think about that before the policy is written. Once we prepare, incorporate, and include a whistleblower policy, what are some of the outcomes that we can expect? Having the policy does not make the issues go away. What makes the issues go away is not having the issues in the first place and conducting business in a very high level, ethical, lack of conflict of interest manner. For organizations that do have whistleblower policies, the outcomes have been 51% have had external investigations of the companies that have resulted as a result of the information that was presented. 37% have had management shakeups. 22% have had criminal investigations, and 11% have had indictments. So clearly there are positive, I guess these are negative outcomes if you're involved. There are positive outcomes if you're someone who is interested in the ethical operation of the business. Considering some of these criteria before you start writing your policy is beneficial. When you are ready to start writing the policy, I've included some example policies that you can find on various websites. You'll notice the Council of Nonprofits has some examples, as well as some examples here from various law firms that include many different provisions. We talked about a number of different options that your whistleblower policy could have. You can find different versions of these policies. I would encourage you to read all of them, take the best pieces of each of them as you are writing your policy, borrow from those best pieces as you develop your policy, and then make something that fits your particular culture very specifically. Don't just change the name on something without having an understanding for how that would fit and how that would work within the particulars of your organization. And with that, I would ask if there are any final questions or any additional comments that anyone else with practice in the field would like to make on the topic of whistleblowers.
Thanks so much, Kevin. You shared some great information, and I know that people will be excited to have those resources there at the end. I did want to remind everyone that while we cannot unmute you, you are able to send in questions to me through the chat window or the Q&A window, and we will read those aloud to Kevin. But we did have one, and I'll let Sanji read that one out.
Yes, Kevin. There was a question and then a follow-up comment. The question is, you talked about developing the whistleblower policy with respect to who should receive the complaint. You talked about the compliance officer, ED, CEOs, board member. It's the board member that, I guess this was a particular interest. for this person, how would a normal line staff person have access? Let's say that this staff person discovered some type of fraudulent practice going on in the organization. How would this staff person have access if he or she didn't feel comfortable disclosing that information internally? How would that person have access to a board member? That's the first question. And then the second question is, you talked about the types of activities that should be covered in the policy, one being conflict of interest. I know we're doing a conflict of interest webinar next week, so if you can expand a little bit more on that particular segment of the policy, that would be greatly appreciated.
Sure. Well, the access to the board or access to anyone related to filing a complaint, the clearer that that can be in the policy, the better the policy is. So my preference related to that would be that the policy actually include the email address or whatever the access point of information is so that that complaint can be lodged. Sometimes the board chair will have an email address at the organization, and so I would encourage the policy to actually include that. Sometimes the board chair will have a mailbox or a suggestion box at the organization to stay in contact with that organization. Whatever means of communication that is would be the best, and having that very clear and transparent in the policy. You certainly don't want to say, well, if you have a complaint, report it to the board chair, and then not list who the board chair is, or not list a telephone number, or not list an email address. That is kind of a dead end and really doesn't get any of the benefit related to the policy in place if you don't provide that linkage. So absolutely, positively, it's a great question, is to make sure that how that communication, what's that linkage so that that communication, that complaint can be lodged with whoever the policy says is the right person. The second question on conflict of interest, clearly this is a great topic to have as an entire webinar. The whole stance of what conflict of interest is would probably be in a separate policy as opposed to being part of the whistleblower policy. Conflict of interest can take many, many forms, right? It can take nepotism, gratuity bribes, inappropriate position. There can be thousands of different types of violation of conflict of interest. So defining what the conflict of interest is and what those standards are within each individual organization would really be resident in the conflict of interest policy, which I fully understand is another topic, and I think that would be a great follow-up topic to this one to have some additional clarity on that. What the whistleblower then policy would do is take it from the point that there was an alleged violation of conflict of interest and it wasn't being resolved. How would that complaint get lodged? So not necessarily to redefine conflict of interest, but rather if there is an alleged violation of that, how would the complaint process take place?
Okay, thank you. I do have another unrelated question in terms of making sure the employees or volunteers are encouraged enough to come forward if they do witness some activities that may be questionable. What are some ways an organization can make employees and staff in general feel comfortable enough without the fear of retaliation to encourage whistleblowing behavior?
Yeah, I think that's always a tough one, right? Because until people see that they won't be negatively impacted, they don't know, they don't have that final level of comfort of doing it. And I don't know that there's any way that you can actually guarantee that people will come forward. What you can do is you can make the environment as open and receptive as possible to it, taking appropriate action on previous instances of whistleblowing, helps build confidence within the organization that that's the case. And it really comes back to that whole concept of tone at the top that we talk about in COSO and other internal control discussions about making sure that the expectation of ethical activity within an organization is the standard, not the exception. And so one thing, having a whistleblower policy is not the only way you establish tone at the top. It's one arrow that's in the quiver of that whole arena about making sure that employees understand your organization operates in an ethical manner. And I like to think of whistleblower as one tool in that toolbox, but certainly not the only piece.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think we have one final question. Let me see. Would you recommend an organization having new employees to sign a separate whistleblower policy as part of their orientation package?
I recommend that employees in new employee orientation receive the employee manual that has the highest level policies and procedures, of which whistleblower would be one of them, and perhaps sign receipt of the entire packet. I think there's a lot of other policies besides whistleblower that are important that the employee understand as well. And I think if they're going to sign that they've received each key policy, they're going to have to sign about 75 different things. And I think after a while that creates some sort of burnout. I think rather having an overview of what is included in the employee handbook, including the whistleblower policy, also perhaps a conflict of interest policy, and then having the employee sign that they understand and that they are responsible for reading that particular tome of information and understanding those policies and procedures, I think is probably a more practical way of doing it. Clearly, you know, when we get to things such as conflict of interest, having the board and the top executive staff signing something like that, I think is probably important to do on an ongoing basis, whether that's annually or semi-annually or whatever. But I don't know that whistleblower necessarily quite gets to that same level in my mind.
Okay, great, thank you. Those were all very great questions that was put out there, so thank you for your response, Kevin.
Absolutely.
So it looks like those are all the questions that we have received. I did want to note, based on the couple questions about conflict of interest, we will be having a conflict of interest webinar next Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern to continue on with our risk mitigation webinar series. I just want to say thank you again to Kevin for this wonderful presentation and all the resources that you shared, and to all of you for joining us today and for all of your questions. And without further ado, we will let you on with the rest of your day. So thanks so much, Kevin.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Kevin.
Bye now.